I was muted. All right, everyone, let's get the show started. Welcome to our DevOps office hours. It's November 11th, 2020. My name is Eric Osterman, and I'll be leading the conversation. I'm the CEO and founder of Cloud Posse. We're a DevOps accelerator, and that means that we help companies own their infrastructure in record time by building it together with your team and then showing them the ropes. If that sounds interesting, head over to cloudposse.com/quiz to get started. Again, that's cloudposse.com/quiz to get started. For those of you new to the call, the format is very informal. My goal is to get your questions answered. So feel free to unmute yourself at any time if you want to jump in and participate. If you're tuning in from our podcast or YouTube channel, you can register for these live and interactive sessions by going to cloudposse.com/office hours. Again, that's cloudposse.com/office hours. We host these calls every week. We'll automatically post a video recording of this session to the office hours Slack channel, as well as follow up with an email that you can share with your team. So with that said, let's kick this off. We got just a couple announcements here on my side. I hadn't had a chance to check out the news too much this week, but if anybody else has something they'd like to add, I'll ask you in a sec. So one kind of not that exciting announcement, but I think I like the announcement because for those involved in migrating like legacy applications over to AWS, anything that you could take off my plate, one less thing that we got to manage, the better. And a very common tool or a very common service is RabbitMQ. Amazon has had support for ActiveMQ called Amazon MQ, and we have a Terraform module for that already. So once the Terraform provider supports the RabbitMQ, I'm sure we'll be adding that as well. So I'll share a link to both our module for that as well as the announcement in the office hours channel. Does this solve any problems for anyone here? Or not? It is pretty legacy technology. So why is this not showing up? Broker. There we go, MQ Broker. So here's our module for that. And the announcement. The other announcement I think will benefit a lot of companies. What that announcement is that Amazon now supports automatic migration of objects between various tiers based on usage patterns. So lifecycle rules were previously enabling us to move objects based on, I guess, when the age of the object. But now objects can be migrated across tiers based on the access of the objects. And the way it looks like it works to me is like an LRU cache almost, least recently used. So objects start in the frequently accessed tier, and based on your rules, they can move to the infrequently accessed tier, and then from there they can ultimately be moved to deep storage and stuff like that. Plus, you can also pay to accelerate the retrieval of objects faster than the SLAs that they guarantee otherwise. I think that this makes a lot of sense for things like access logs, which you probably just forget about, and they just sit there forever, and they go ultimately into deep storage, but you can still relatively easily retrieve them. The other, I think it's less probably useful for things like um, active content on a website, like thumbnails or images, because uh, you're probably not going to want to have those offline for like 5 hours or 12 hours or whatever those things are, even if they are infrequently accessed. When they are accessed, you want those to show up in a reasonable time. So um, does this sound interesting to anyone here? Also, Vlad shared just a bunch of announcements here. Vlad, do you want to go through any of those announcements that stood out to you?
Sure. Yeah, those were like very relevant for my interest.
Mm,
So ECS now supports IPv6. including Fargate on ECS, which for people that wanted IPv6 support, this is a big deal. Finally, after a lot of time, Fargate for ECS now supports native references to config files and secrets in Secret Manager. The config file thing was an absolute pain. I personally hit it a bunch of times when migrating older applications to Fargate. So very happy that's launched. And what else was in there? Hold up. Yeah, DynamoDB exports to S3. Those are awesome because now you can just
That's
dump
cool.
your big DynamoDB tables to S3. And I imagine you'll be able to query them with Athena and do a bunch of stuff on data that would be otherwise very expensive to scan on. Like if you have a table that's, I don't know, a couple terabytes or whatever, you don't really want to do a full table scan. Exporting it to S3 and then doing
Does
machine
it let
learning
you
or analytics on it is awesome.
does it let you load from S3 then as well?
I don't know. I think it, I don't
That
know.
could be a pretty interesting way to move a database across accounts, for example. Um,
Something to look into. I
yeah.
really don't know.
All right.
And yeah, the latest thing is EventBridge now supports Event Replay, which for event-driven architectures is awesome.
That is very cool. Any other announcements from you, Vlad, or anyone else? Interesting news items that you've seen this week?
I mean, can you repeat the thing about moving databases across towns? I didn't catch that.
Oh, that was me trying to find a use case for the solution for the feature here. So Vlad brought up that now you can export a DynamoDB table to S3. Um, Presumably, you could then run Athena queries against it. But I was really interested in like, what if you have a massive database here and you want to do a migration between AWS accounts? Maybe this is a good way to do an ETL of that and then load it on the other side. But I don't know if DynamoDB, if it provides a way to load that data.
AWS Data Pipeline supports it. I'm
Okay.
looking at, I'm gonna post the link to something in the developer guide. They also have a thing for dedicated for databases, AWS database migration thingy, something that I
Mhm.
know supports moving a bunch of databases. I
Including Dynamo,
I
the
don't
DMS.
know.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure myself either.
Yeah, database migration service. This is it. And it supports Oracle to Oracle, Aurora. Yep. Apparently also seems to support DynamoDB and DocumentDB and Redshift.
Cool. That's cool. That might come up in a project that we're maybe going to be involved in soon. So, what we can get into then are a few talking points. I think we set a new record today for the number of questions asked in the Office Hours channel. So, at some point I was just like, and we'll see the rest of the channels in the Office Hours channel. So, here are a few that stood out right away to me that we can talk about to get the conversation started. So, I think Eric Berg, you were asking about SLA monitoring for upstream dependencies.
Yeah, our CFO has talked to me about that, wanting to be able to make claims and related, defend claims by customers. But that's pretty much taken care of by Datadog.
Yeah.
Um, we were thinking of setting up something to regularly check, but I think we're probably at this point just going to post events or a metric if a third party is down, because
Yeah.
that's why I'm here asking what you guys think.
So actually, it's interesting you bring up the latter. That was going to be the first suggestion I have, and I'll show you a way you could go about doing that, perhaps. The other is using then synthetics. So Datadog synthetics, you could write up to somehow query that third-party service. The challenge is, what you want to do is get to the meat of the problem that's impacting your service. whether their marketing site is online or not, that doesn't really, help you. What you want to know is that their API is returning responses in, 200 milliseconds or less or something, and how often is
Right.
that violated. So for
Right.
that, yeah, go on.
Well, I was going to say, what I was thinking was that you could have a set of one or more, endpoints that you would be hitting, to your point, because you need to define what it is that constitutes upness or downness. But you also have to consider that synthetics are expensive. And,
Yeah.
depending on your interval, you can like quickly, chew through your budget in like a day if you're not careful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things.
So, two things for your consideration, especially if you want it for like transparency reasons, is looking at what you get with OpsGenie. So, or two things, OpsGenie and Status Page. So, in what you can get with, let me see if this logs me in this time. With OpsGenie is you can pull in events or alerts from any service that uses statuspage.io because statuspage.io is an Atlassian company.
Right. We had actually, I didn't know that you could do this directly from OpsGenie. And, one of the hacks we put in place was to subscribe an OpsGenie service or, team to the statuspage.io email alerts.
Yeah. So if you have an enterprise OpsGenie account, which sounds super, super expensive, but compared to like PagerDuty, it's not bad. And compared to some others. And then you have these external services here. So here are like some that I've added that we depend on. And you'll find quite a library of services available here that you can, add. I don't know, like, yeah, so you depend on Shopify, bam, click that. Now you'll get the incidents for that. And the other thing is if you have a status page, like here's CodeFresh's status page. 99% of the companies that I come across that have status pages are just using statuspage.io. And when you depend on statuspage.io, your status page can become the composite of all the services you depend on. Much the same way I was doing that in OpsGenie. So this is a great way that you can convey to your customers, look, this is the state of affairs for everything that we're doing right now.
Gotcha. That's great. Thanks.
Cool.
I think that's overkill.
Oh,
Like, are you gonna spend money on CloudWatch synthetics to hit an API every minute when you might only be using that API 2 times a month? That feels very wasteful to me.
Yeah.
well, I mean, the status page is not that expensive as far as these things go. I mean, for a small
Yeah,
scrappy.
status page, no,
Yeah.
but like, what are you trying to achieve? Because if you wanna showcase when your partners and your providers aren't living up to their SLAs, ideally you would want to do that with non-test data. You would want to do that with a payload that is relevant. And for that, I would go for SLOs and observability at the app level. But that's a beast to implement. So I get it if you don't want to do that.
Yeah,
But
so
like,
this is the
what is the
non-Yak JD
CFO's
approach.
goal?
Yeah.
Basically, if making claims, like basically getting money back when providers are down. And again, we are trying to make sure that we've got the right information internally, which probably will be SLO monitors and Datadog.
It seems like this is actually a great business opportunity. I don't know, says the guy who hasn't done any research on it. But there are companies out there that will help you automatically get all your duty-free money back. There are companies that out there that'll help negotiate your all your utility bills, cable bills, phone bills down to other rates. Maybe there should be a company that all it does is monitor the status of all these SaaS services and help you claim your discounts based on SLA violations and things like that.
Totally. You know,
I
I
don't know.
was, I,
Go on.
go ahead, Eric, sorry.
I don't know if there's enough outages or enough money on the table for it to be viable, though.
Well, CFOs only have to think there is, at least for
Yeah.
a while.
I guess it's going to be that, once every 3-year Amazon outage, that's when your business is going to spike and then go down again.
To
All right.
actually get reimbursement from AWS SLAs, you have to provide them with actual requests that fail, though.
Oh, really?
And I know it was a big mess when they had, what was it, the S3 outage, their
Yeah.
big traumatizing outage. Getting SLA credit for that was intense.
Yeah. But a service like this that I described would probably have access, would need access to CloudTrail logs or something of that nature.
Yeah. Well, there's
What?
your argument for multi-cloud, Eric, from last week, because if that ran on AWS and AWS had an outage, then you wouldn't be able to prove that AWS had an outage.
Yeah. Well, yeah, possibly. Or after it comes back, it's probably there in some way.
Yeah.
So you can spend, $2 million operating the second region so you can claim your $50,000 deduction for a service outage.
You know, I happened to be on a call with a couple of Datadog product managers. I think it was like the monitoring guy and the logging guy. And I was like, you guys should totally be providing metrics on third-party, uptime.
That'd be
services.
cool, yeah. And they have probably a
That'd be
lot of
great.
that data
Like
based on what they do.
a CAN metric that came from your third parties, boom, fits right in with everything.
Yeah.
Well,
Also-
I do know specifically, sorry, on Datadog. Datadog does have a statuspage.io integration as well. So anytime anyone updates their status in there, you can basically get an alert into your events, and then you could then do things based on that event coming in within Datadog as well. And that you don't need synthetics or anything else to do that.
Yeah.
That's great. Both of those are great ideas, guys. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. All right. The next question is from, sorry, go on. Who was that?
To mention, as somebody that used to run SaaS services at scale, they're like, if Datadog sees issues with a SaaS service that is properly architected, they're gonna see issues with like a single cell or just a couple customers. And that theoretical service would be very, very misleading, because some people would get like everything is working fine, 100%, everything is ideal, and for others it would be
Possibly.
slightly elevated error rates or everything is down. So it's very, very easy to say when people are affected.
A lot of these hosted monitoring SaaS solutions come out after these big events saying, hey, we saw this 2 hours before Amazon published it, because they have such a bird's eye view of everything going on in the ecosystem. So actually having a third party kind of neutral source, I bet a lot of outages out there can be observed far before vendors come out with it, if that data were not protected under some privacy rules.
Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah. All right. So Tim Gurley, I'm not sure exactly how to say Gorley, had a question about.
Gurley. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. About how to deal with your Terraform, how to deal with when you have multiple things affecting your AWS state, of which some of that stuff is managed with Terraform and some of that stuff might be Lambdas. A pretty common pattern in AWS land is to do some of the complex last minute manipulation with Lambdas, for example. And when that happens, perhaps the state that Terraform knows about doesn't match what's been deployed. So the naive approach, the naive answer of this, which is probably not the answer you want, is, well, you can ignore lifecycle changes on the Terraform side, but then you manually have to know to taint and reapply those things later on when they change. I'm guessing that was not the answer you wanted, right?
Yeah, correct.
So this is just to bring it up for everyone else here. Here's the pinned question. By the way, if you're in the Slack team and you filter for the pinned messages, those are all the questions we want to cover. So let's see here. So my question is about how resources that are changed outside of Terraform are managed. For example, we have a Mongo cluster set up with 9 EC2 instances in a 3x3x3 configuration. Creating the cluster in Terraform is straightforward, but as part of our security processes, we have this Lambda that listens to the AMI update events and then updates the cluster with new nodes in a very complicated dance of configuration updates. In the end, all of the nodes EC2 instances have been replaced and the cluster has had no downtime, which is perfect, but now the Terraform state is completely out of sync from what is deployed. So how do we handle this, and is there a better way of doing it? So this is the challenge. It's like when you're using all these cool vendor products that were designed that meet like the checkbox compliance requirements, but don't integrate into your tool chain of infrastructure as code. So another consideration here would be, for example, if this is also probably not the answer you want, but another way of looking at it is you have the wrong tool for the job. Like you're an organization practicing modern DevOps and you're using this other thing that's modifying resources on the fly in AWS, which is cool from a demo perspective, but not cool from this DevOps perspective. Instead, if you look at tools like Checkov, maybe they meet some of those things. I don't know if Checkov will identify vulnerable AMI images and help you with that. But the idea, or I said Checkov, I meant to say Bridgecrew. But I think the idea with Bridgecrew is that they're proactively scanning your repositories for misconfigurations or vulnerabilities and open PRs for you. So what you really want is your software to be opening a PR with those changes, and that goes through your standard process with everything else. Rather than trying to solve this on the other end, we've drifted. How do we absorb that drift? And who's to say that is desirable drift versus non-desirable drift? It's causing problems that.
Yeah, for some situations, I mean, it is a more declarative problem. I think in the case that I was discussing here with the database,
yeah,
we're actually bringing up nodes, syncing, the replicas into those nodes, and then they join the clusters, and then other nodes fall out. So, it's there's just a bunch more configuration going on, and I don't know how I would model that in Terraform, in an abstract enough way that. That's my struggle.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair struggle because that's the other complaint with Terraform, right? So Terraform is a pretty heavy-handed tool. It's basically a tool designed to run crude migrations against infrastructure outside of transactions, and if something goes wrong, that's up to you to figure out. And there's no way to really coordinate a complex rollout strategy like that. Compare that or contrast that with Kubernetes, which is a framework for cloud automation and operations. And this is where you would have an operator that implements kind of like what you did with your Lambdas. The difference is that operator is actively updating the state in Kubernetes. Now, how does that state get back to, I guess, your source control? That would be another synchronization issue. So hard problem. I think the best thing is to try and so I guess to me the ideal architecture for this is you have an operator that's responsible for managing how you release new versions of software to Mongo, but determining that you have a new version of Mongo or a new AMI that you need to release, that's a separate process. That process PRs against the infrastructure repository that you have for that, kicks off that process. And that process triggers the operator to do those rollouts. And I think that's a better architecture.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I guess another alternative is just use, the Terraform for that particular module only once for creation. And then the life cycle continues only with Lambda updates.
Yeah.
And just knowingly, if you do need to go back, then maybe you're starting from snapshots or something. Okay, very good. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, sounds good. Let's see what the next question was here. How to harden EKS nodes, and there was a little bit more details to that one. Let's see. Hi, folks. Hi, have folks ever tried hardening the EKS worker node images, and what would be the best way to go about it? Using one of the CIS hardened AMI images as the base image, and then adding on and configuring the cube components to initially set it up is what comes to mind, unless somebody already has this. We haven't yet gone through this particular exercise, but I think the gist of what you're saying is right. You would use one of the CIS hardened AMI images, and using the latest features of the EKS managed node groups, you can now have a custom launch template and user data that then sets up the rest of the stuff you need on there. Or of course, you can go the Packer route and build your own Packer images based on that with those configurations. Anybody else have suggestions on this?
I'll just
Nikki
point
Paul
out.
Rocket.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Matt,
whoever
go
was
ahead.
speaking. I was just going to say really quickly. I'll post in the channel that there's actually an AWS Labs issue opened about this, and there doesn't seem to be a good answer from anyone there either. They basically, someone else pointed out like that they only got a 50% or 58% score or something like that on when they scanned it with the against CIS, the base images, and then they said, "Is there a CIS version of the EKS base image?" And everyone said no, but no one's actually given a good answer yet. So it's a problem.
Thanks, man.
Speaking a little bit more generally, I think if you have to meet compliance standards on a Kubernetes cluster, you're gonna get a lot further, a lot faster by going with a distribution of Kubernetes that focuses on that type of thing. So like either OpenShift or D2IQ are the ones that I know of. They're really hard into the government, so they have to be compliant with DFARS and all that. If you need a compliant Kubernetes cluster for something, I would, my first call is going to be over to, OpenShift or D2IQ or something.
Yeah, there's also Gravity by Gravitational, and they've open sourced large parts of that as well, but don't have firsthand experience. That's a really good recommendation, though, Andy. Vendors are going to have the largest incentive to keep that stuff up to date and do the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah.
And rolling your own is going to be a lot of effort.
Yeah, especially if you need, like, in order to connect to a government network, you need something called an ATO, an authority to operate. And, you have to meet all kinds of NIST standards, and it's a difficult process, and going with something that, has already been ATO'd in the past is a lot better than rolling your own.
Are you getting any of that with Rancher or no? Because I know you're using Rancher. No. Yeah. Okay.
No, D2IQ is what we use when we need an ATO on a Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, maybe share some of those links, Andy, if you can, in the thread of that message. Cool. Anything else?
AWS also has the Bottle Rocket, new fancy operating system that's purpose built for containers that I know is like super stripped down and has security as a guiding principle. I don't know if it's CS compliant though.
Yeah, that would be interesting if to what degree it meets that.
It doesn't even have a shell, for example.
Yeah. Huh, that's interesting. I'll share this just in case it's relevant. Cool. Let's see what the next question is. So, any advice on implementing the CIS benchmark requirements for AWS? I think there was also a little bit more context in the message, so let me pull that up here. Where was it? Hi there, I'm working on implementing the CIS benchmark requirements in AWS. My goal is to go through the CIS Amazon Web Services Foundation's benchmark document and manually connect resources. Then I plan to automate the creation of the resources through Terraform. I feel like this is a pretty standard thing, but I'm new to cloud and Terraform, and has anyone done this before? So I think there's a few things here that going on at the same time to talk about. It's also something that we are looking into right now at Cloud Posse. In fact, Matt on the call here is leading the charge on that. So with CIS, there's two sides of it. One is like monitoring that you have compliance, and two is actually instrumenting that you have compliance, or like provisioning your infrastructure in such a way that you're compliant. So on the former side, the way we're approaching it is using the AWS Guard Duty service, which can be, or no, Security Hub service rather, the AWS Security Hub service, which supports a bunch of rule sets out of the box, and CIS is one of those. So it's not ready for public consumption yet, but Cloud Posse is working on a module for that. I'll share a link to the repo so you guys can follow along. There's not that much to it actually to get this first part set up, and then there's actually provisioning your resources to satisfy those rules. That's a really open-ended topic, and it depends on your architecture. It depends on what you have deployed and what you're using and what your requirements are and all that other stuff. Matt, what would you like to add to that?
I think you pretty much covered it, other than there are definitely some things that we will probably do as a follow-on engagement to what we're working on now, that will configure some of the standard AWS services that we provision in a CIS compliant manner as well. So I think that that's probably in the future a little bit as we look at some of this, but there's no easy solution to just make it all happen, unfortunately.
One other tip, one other recommendation is Bridge Crew. So what Cloud Posse is doing is we're working together with Bridge Crew. This probably more towards the beginning of next year, maybe part of the end of this year is. So Bridge Crew, they support compliance scanning and will tell you if your Terraform code meets certain requirements. So this is they perform static analysis, and it's built on top of the open source tool called Checkov. Checkov is another tool by Bridge Crew that they've open sourced and is the core of what their SaaS offering does. But the SaaS offering brings all the canned rule sets and continuous monitoring, and the SaaS offering will even open pull requests against your infrastructure repositories to fix vulnerabilities that come up, or non-compliance, let's say.
Did I miss you mention that Cloud Posse has the module which configures alarms? I think we used it for, it might have been a prior version of the benchmark, but to me, a lot of the tedious configuration was with all the alarms that were required to operate off the CloudTrail. I mean, so the Security Hub, I mean, there's a few things there along with, configuring the trail and guard duty and whatnot, but there's not a high number of resources there. To me, the alarm configuration was the most tedious, and you did, you do have a module for that. So thanks for that.
I think that's actually, I want to claim credit for that, but I think there's somebody else that has like the AWS security baseline that you might be thinking of. We don't have that baseline module with all like the AWS config rules yet or anything like that, if that's what you're thinking. Was it AWS config related?
I thought it was under. No, this was mostly the alarm configuration. Let me.
Oh, maybe maybe
have to dig it up.
I think we do have one. It's just been a long time since I looked at that one.
Yeah, it's actually called Terraform AWS CloudTrail CloudWatch Alarms. Or hang on.
Yeah, that's the one. Thank you for posting that one out. Yeah, we should, Matt. We should go and take a look at that one and update it based on the stuff we're doing here too. Thanks. It's funny when you get so big that you forget about the modules you have. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so those were the 4 questions I had called out in my show notes here. I'm going to go into Slack and see what the other pinned questions were here. let's see here. So that one we answered. That one we answered. That one we answered. That one we answered.
We solved DevOps. Woo!
I think it was a thread on the one I'm thinking of was a thread here on a call for questions. Here we go. All right, so AK, are you on the call?
Yes, yes, I'm on the call. My name is Arvind. How are you guys?
Hey, Arvin. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
So yeah, let's see if we can help you through this. I do have Jeremy. Are you on the call? Might not have Jeremy on the call. So this is where I don't have the day-to-day experience on all these modules. Okay, cool. So we'll see if we can help you get through the problem that you have with this module. So basically, you're seeing this error where it's saying that the ID or name must be set for the launch template. The first question I always ask with these things is, did you try first using the example that we have? Because all of our modules have an example in the examples complete folder. And before we merge to master, the tests for provisioning the module must pass. Now, those are not always, comprehensive tests for everything, but at a minimum, what we achieve in this example here should work. So it helps to understand where you're starting from.
Yeah, so yes, I did run the example as well, except I didn't use the VPC and the subnets. I just put the subnets as an array, and I had my own VPC ID. I think the question is, when you look at the actual module, it was basically how it's dynamically generating the array between the template versus the mixed instance policy. So because it looks to see if what it should set to null, because if you don't have a mixed instance policy, I think it's supposed to just create a template by adding the ID to it, with the labels that are generated. But I think that's where the issue is, but I'm not able to figure out exactly follow the process there. But yes, I did follow just straight example as well, and I got the same error.
Okay, so let's see, Jeremy, does anything jump out at you at this? Otherwise, we should just probably.
I'm having a little trouble following exactly what you're trying to do, but I can say that you're trying to create a Eric, go back to the main page, the README.
Yeah.
If you're trying to create an auto-scaling group that has mixed instances, you have to create that separately and pass the ID in.
Yeah, I don't need mixed instances. I just need one launch template, and then the auto scaling group. But what happens is that even like looking at the examples, even if I just run the example which has the mixed one, where we're setting what type of instances that we want, and saying, hey, go for it, even then it's not able to get the ID. I think somewhere
you can only have, if you're using a managed node group or workers.
Oh, okay. So I'm not doing EKS. I was just using this as just a normal auto scaling group and just a template for it. That's it.
I was going to see if we had we have this
EKS,
advanced example here, but
EKS workers is for an EKS group. We have a separate module for auto scaling group.
No, that's the one he's talking about, Jeremy. He's talking about the other one. This is the one I had open here, EC2 auto scale group. I brought up the EKS workers module because I thought had maybe a more advanced example that would help him through. So let's pause it there. I'm gonna just send. This is not answering your question. I'm just gonna link it here in case you can look over it and see anything. Instead, why don't you escalate this in the Terraform channel, and we can have maybe Andre or somebody else on our team see if anything jumps out at you.
Sure, sounds good. I did that. Do you just want me to tag the same question?
Yeah. So we are a small team on our side.
I know.
And,
No. Yeah, and I apologize. This is my first time, so I don't know the rules and how this works. But I mean, first of all, I want to thank you guys for doing this. This is actually pretty awesome.
All right. So now that I'm understanding that you're just trying to create an auto scaling group.
Exactly.
What is the error you're getting?
That it's not able to, the template ID or name needs to be set up when creating
Jeremy,
the auto scaling group.
It's on my screen. Does everyone see my screen here? Am I sharing my whole window? I think I am.
Yes, we can see it.
Cool.
All right. Well, this has not been converted to the current null label. So it might be related to that.
Okay.
I think the 7.31 was converted, but I'll double check just in case. That's a good one. I'll double check that as well.
All right.
That's really nice. Thanks.
You triggered my Alexa. That's pretty funny. All right. So let's see here. There's another question here from Chris. I've searched through the archives and Google's not helping either. So hopefully this isn't described somewhere I haven't just missed. I'm working on setting up a new infrastructure utilizing Cloud Posse's open source and bumped into a few issues. I got all the accounts set up and that is working. Also got EKS and other application backing services like RDS, all using Terraform. But I'm having troubles finding out how to make the next steps through infrastructure as code. In particular, I'm trying to get CodeFresh set up for GitOps, but it's not clear how to do this as infrastructure as code. I got my CodeFresh account set up using GitHub and auth, but to add EKS integration, for example, I used this account, but I did this by hand, which seems wrong. And then I set up the project pipelines to do that. I'm working through the Cloud Posse CodeFresh repo, but this, yeah, so the Cloud Posse CodeFresh repo is, first of all, if you look at the commit times, it's going to be really old. We don't have anything public that shows you how to use CodeFresh with Terraform. I don't think we have a public repo on that. And in general, my feeling about continuous delivery with Terraform has evolved. And, you know, we started using a lot of Atlantis, but we've kind of pulled back from Atlantis. The project has not adopted some of the features we really wanted, and there are some other alternatives now. So for Terraform, you might want to consider some of the SaaS offerings for deploying and managing it. And the reason for that is to do deployments of Terraform in a CI/CD setting is a little complicated. The best practice is, you know, you do a Terraform plan and then you store that plan as an artifact somewhere. That artifact has secrets in it, so you got to be very careful about that plan. And then you review or audit that, and then you approve. That means that it's a asynchronous process potentially, and in the meantime, other PRs can come up modifying that same state. And then what happens to that plan file that you just had? That should be invalidated. So now you have this state engine that has to manage plans across pull requests in the same repo, and it gets very messy. And Terraform is not, deploying Terraform, unfortunately, is not as simple as deploying every other app in your organization, like to a cluster or something. Like deploying a container is a much simpler problem than deploying Terraform code. I say all of that because we went through this exercise with CodeFresh a few times, doing Terraform with it. And yes, it does the job. And this is not a criticism of CodeFresh. You would have the same challenge if you're using Jenkins, Circle CI, or whatever. And if you want to manage that much complexity in your CI pipeline or continuous delivery pipelines for Terraform, you can have at it. But we're kind of trying to offload that thought leadership to a SaaS provider. So SaaS providers are like Terraform Cloud, Spacelift, Scalar, N0, and there's probably even more out there as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that information, because I actually watched one of the collaborative videos you did with them, and it seemed like a really great way, but I think my question is a little bit larger in question of, like, for example, like I applied the Helm file or installed the chart to kind of get that CodeFresh account created. But again, I applied it by hand, which it seems like that should be part of.
But it's a chicken and the egg. Yeah, it's a chicken and the egg conundrum, right? Yeah. So you're provisioning the RBAC rules that gives CodeFresh the permission to do CodeFreshy things on your cluster. So CodeFresh can't then, it's a chicken and the egg. CodeFresh can't itself provision its own service account in the Kubernetes cluster. So this is a cold start problem for establishing your platform integration with CodeFresh.
Okay, but say I was going to follow like what you did with CodeFresh, just because that's what I have, I'm referencing currently, is when you go to set up that first pipeline or a pipeline for each of your, definitions in your conf directory.
Yeah.
Like, is that something where that is run as code, or is that literally set up? Like, that's where I'm having the disconnect of
I totally got your disconnect there. So I totally got your disconnect there. And I think that's a great question that you brought up, and I can speak to it. So for everybody else's context, just so we get on the same page, let me bring up an example, a contrasting example to this. What he's talking about is there's a number of pipelines that you need set up in order for this automation to work. And the CI system that we're talking about right now is CodeFresh, but it's similar to if we were using Circle CI, Travis, Jenkins, whatever. How do those pipeline configurations come about? And it's so trivial, like if you're using GitHub Actions, it's just obvious. You add the pipeline here, GitHub calls them workflows, and then voila, they appear. Like they just work magically. There's no setup or configuration. But with most other CI/CD systems, adding the file to your repository is not enough for the pipeline just to automatically exist and do things. This is good and bad. The bad thing is if it automatically sets up and accesses secrets, then you can exfiltrate a lot of sensitive information that is presumably stored in your CI system that enables you to integrate with services or clusters. But the good thing is when it happens is that the developer experience is amazing. Like they don't have to go tap anybody's shoulder to set something up. As it relates to CodeFresh, there's a similar challenge, and what you're referring to is a good example to start at, but this example is out of date. So we have our CodeFresh repository here, and inside of the CodeFresh repository was one of our first attempts at automating this process. But you see, this was really 2 years ago, and we haven't touched it since, and there's no pull request activity going on, etc. What we were doing here, so in CodeFresh, let's see where I wanted to go first. So one of the things CodeFresh does that's different from other CI platforms is they separate the configuration of the pipeline with the configuration of the workflow. So what I have here is the YAML configuration of a pipeline, but this is not the pipeline itself. This is not like your Jenkins file or your Circle CI file. This is just how that should work. And then the specification of your workflow that you can specify in 3 or 4 different ways. So one of those is a remote URL, one is inline, one is a file in the repository corresponding to the branch you're working on, etc. CodeFresh, I think, is working on something so that it can work like GitHub Actions and automatically register the pipelines and create them for you just by opening a pull request. We've solved this for one customer right now in a very proprietary way that I wouldn't repeat. What we have is literally a cron job scanning all of the repositories for a pipeline configuration like this, and when it sees it, it adds it. That's a very brute force way. It doesn't work well if you have 300, 400 repositories like we have. So the way that I would tackle this right now, if CodeFresh does not support it out of the box yet, and that's a question you have to raise to your account manager. But right now what I would do is I'd have a GitHub action that triggers, and GitHub actions work automatically. And the GitHub action would look to see if this repository has a CodeFresh configuration, a CodeFresh manifest. And then that pipeline would apply it to CodeFresh using the CodeFresh CLI. And CodeFresh has a GitHub action, but I don't know if they have a GitHub action for this purpose. Is the gist of what I'm saying clear? Should I stop or explain anything more?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. Basically, because the GitHub actions will automatically happen, then basically just use that as your egg to get your chicken.
Yeah. Exactly, you totally got it.
You know, so I guess one of the questions then is like, you know, now are you guys seeing that CodeFresh is not kind of the best way to go about this, and are you guys maybe migrating to GitHub Actions, and is it proving as, you know, as good for you? Because I mean, you guys definitely have been a big proponent of CodeFresh and its visibility into and awareness of Kubernetes, but you know, GitHub Actions is newer, and you know, if you had to decide today, which way are you guys leaning?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question, very real question that comes up regularly, because you know we do consulting with customers on release engineering to this effect. Today we have, I would say, one really mature strategy for how we do release engineering, and that is still CodeFresh. We've spent a lot of time this year working on a Jenkins solution, because Jenkins is still pretty popular in enterprises. And using Jenkins operator and configuration as code and some of this stuff, you can get ultimately to a pretty cool solution, but man, it's a lot of surface area and I don't recommend it. And the other thing we're investing in is GitHub Actions. So let me compare and contrast CodeFresh with GitHub Actions, and I think that'll help you in your decision process. So there are a lot of things that CodeFresh does that I've just taken for granted, having used it for the last few years, and it makes things very easy. One of those things is building an image in one step, maybe building multiple images in one step, parallel, and then running those same images in the next step. Can't do that with GitHub Actions. So you got to decouple those things, but it's a really nice flow, like build the test image, run the test image. And the other really nice thing that CodeFresh makes it easy is to run a Docker composition. So build your test image, run a composition that validates the test image as the next step. I think that's really nice. Also not that easy to do using native steps in GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions ultimately run on a VM. Ultimately, you can script whatever you want, so you can achieve more or less the same outcome. But I like the declarative steps of the workflows in a GitHub action, and I don't want to rely on shell scripts as much as I would. And for CodeFresh, you get that out of the box. The next thing are approval gates, or approval steps. So it's very nice when you have maybe a preview environment spun up automatically on your pull request, and then you have a step that says, hey, when that pull request is merged to master, you can have an approval step that actually protects that from getting destroyed unless somebody actually clicks approve to destroy that environment. Or if you're trying to use CodeFresh for more continuous delivery, you might want to have an approval step. So when you merge to master, what happens is it automatically deploys to a master environment, for example, or main environment. And then it automatically has an approval step after that and queues up a deployment to staging. So then I click approve and bam, it automatically goes out to staging. And now there's an approval step to go out to production. And approval steps are really nice, and approval steps don't exist in GitHub Actions. But if that's not a requirement for what you're building, then GitHub Actions is maybe an acceptable thing. The other thing to consider is that the ecosystem of technologies around CD are vast and growing. There's Argo CD, there's Go CD, there's Flux CD, there's Spinnaker, there's Harness.io, and the list goes on out there. And continuous delivery more and more is a science in and of itself, that you might want to consider what tools will help you do continuous delivery just as a solution, and make sure that that continuous delivery solution supports approval steps.
Okay, well, I really appreciate the information. That's awesome.
Cool. Anybody else have related questions on this topic?
More like a comment of color. We actually implemented like manual approvals with issues on our company. And it was pretty neat with GitHub Actions. So
yeah, can you go into like what your strategy was to do approval steps with your GitHub Actions?
Well, we did something like chat ops in the issue.
Okay, I got you. Yeah. Something like that could work. I really wish that labels could be protected in some way with GitHub repos and pull requests, so that labels, that certain systems could add labels and that those could be the gates, but not anybody could add those labels.
I mean, what we did was there is a list of code owners, and only the code owners can comment. And when those code owners comment and then approve, then it deploys. So I assume something like that could be done with tags, because I think the tag event also tells you who tagged it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for chiming in on that alternative approach for that. All right, well, we are out of time for today. It's already 12:30 our time here, so I'm going to wrap things up. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We had a lot of interesting conversations here. Andy, who's on the call, he's going to slice this video up and post it to our YouTube channel into different segments so that you can share that with your team. As always, if you'd like to have a conversation with me or somebody on my team, you can head over to cloudposse.com/quiz. Again, that's cloudposse.com/quiz. And we look forward to talking with you soon at some point. Recording of this call will be shared in the Office Hours channel and syndicated to our podcast at podcast.cloudposse.com. Again, that's podcast.cloudposse.com. See you all next week, same time, same place.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.